Alright, folks, it's the Pedantic Skeptic here. Still in Idaho, probably for another 2 days. I wanted to make some content earlier in the week, but I've just been exhausted. I've just been doing a lot of hiking, and I have walked over some really rough terrain, and it's been fun, but it's also been exhausting. I have some energy tonight, so I'm going to pre-make some stuff and probably just have delayed publishings of the videos or whatever. Now, because I haven't done this in a long time, actually, let me just see when the last time I responded to, let me just see. I haven't responded to Answers in Genesis crap since January, so because I know you guys like to see me in pain, I'm going to respond to an Answers in Genesis video, I guess. I gotta knock myself down to their level, so I'm gonna drink some Riesling. Whoops. God, it's all over me now. Just a sec. Damn it. It's alright. It's not a bad Riesling, though. So anyway. So in case you don't know who AIG is, it's a creationist institute. It is a group of people who literally believe in Genesis, the creation account. Oh crap, I didn't mean to do that. That's alright. And they have this cringy YouTube channel, right? And it's got a lot of just clickbaity stuff. You're gonna see it in a minute. And they don't have anything of substance. It's just kind of amusing to go through their videos. And I am trained as a biologist, specifically a community ecologist, mostly focusing on plant-insect interactions. There is an hopefully arthropod related video that we're gonna see. So let's just do this. So there's this video here. Hang on a second. Okay. Sorry. I got distracted. Yeah, there's this video. Atheists are lying to you about evidence for evolution. Answers in Genesis. So let's see what this is about.
We turned your roofing nightmares into dreams.
What the hell?
The Tale of the Heike is considered one of the great classics of medieval Japanese literature. It's primarily an epic about samurai warrior culture, which ultimately laid the groundwork for Japanese Bushido ideology, or what's known as the Way of the Warrior. The Heike is roughly divided into 3 sections. It includes a number of love stories and features some very memorable characters, such as the arrogant, evil, and ruthless central figure of the first section, Taira no Kiramori, who's described as so consumed by the fires of hatred that his fevered body won't cool even while immersed in water after death. It's pretty theatrical stuff. Of course, a good drama usually includes some pivotal action scenes, and the Heike doesn't disappoint. It includes a central confrontation based in real history between the imperial rulers of Japan, the Taira clan, and the Minamoto clan, which lead to the famous Battle of Dan-no-ura on April 24th, 1185 AD. The ruling Taira clan, also known as the Heike, keep that in mind for later, had ruled Japan for many decades and was led by their child emperor, Antoku. But being massively outnumbered in this battle, they were soundly defeated. Now, as the legendary part of the story goes, in a climactic moment, seeing their doom was inevitably upon them, General Tokiko, rather than allowing the 7-year-old emperor to be captured by the opposing forces, leaps into the water with them, drowning him, with most loyal members and generals of the Taira clan following them through their death with honor. Legend says that Antoku later came to be worshipped as Mizo no Kami, the god of water. And this is where the tale begins to relate to our topic, the question of ultimate origins. You see, Hycopsis japonica, or what is known as dorip, is a species of crab native to Japan.
I never would have guessed.
And it has a shell that bears a pattern resembling a human face.
I mean, like, if you squint hard enough or take enough LSD, I guess.
Which many relate to the face of an angry samurai, hence the nickname, the samurai crab.
Yeah, okay. People name species after things that the species reminds them of, for the most part. I mean, I wouldn't have given this organism the name that it has. Hang on. I would have named this after a certain part of male anatomy, but that's a different story.
And it was once said that these crustaceans were ghostly reincarnations of the Heike warriors.
Yeah, because people back then didn't know shit about biology and just had stupid ideas about where things came from and what they were actually about. What are you trying to prove?
Defeated at the Battle of Dan-no-ura, transformed into crabs in that watery grave that each bear the grotesque visage of an armored samurai's face, the Heike crab. As a matter of fact, in the 1964 Japanese anthology film Kwaidan, the narrator recounts the story of the Battle of Dan-no-ura and explains the myth, along with some prominent footage of the crabs being illustrated. Now, how does this relate to the issue of Genesis creation versus the evolutionary story so commonly held in our culture today? Well, there have been a vast number of iconic but often very misleading and sometimes downright fraudulent evidences used over the years to convince people of the story of evolution. Peppered moths, Piltdown men, Haeckel's embryo drawings, the vestigial appendix, etc. Evolutionary evidences.
Okay, let's go through those, shall we?
Evidences used over the years to convince people of the story of evolution. Peppered moth.
That's Biston bicellaria. It is a geometric moth native to Europe. Remember, I do mostly Lepidoptera and other plant-eating insects. So the story goes, for those of you who aren't familiar, during the Industrial Revolution, there was a decline in the mottled, speckly colored peppered moths because of all the soot that was released into the air, and the idea was that because the trees were covered in soot, people were seeing more of the dark colored moths because they weren't getting eaten by birds. Now, this isn't entirely true just because the coloration of the moths isn't a strictly genetic trait, and that's why it's not totally bullshit, but it's definitely not a direct result of the coal being burned and ash being in the air during the Industrial Revolution like it was originally thought. We know Piltdown Man was a fraud. Okay. We already know that.
Piltdown Man, Haeckel's embryo draw.
What's wrong with Haeckel? Now, of course, Haeckel's drawings aren't perfectly accurate. I mean, how can they be? They're not, so precise that we should be relying on them necessarily as, how embryos develop. The main idea was just to get a general outline of, what organs and appendages develop first, and, what the patterns in, the development of these vertebrate organisms are.
Drawings, the vestigial appendix.
Yes. Okay. So, this is where creationists like to take words like vestigial and give them different meanings. Now, in science, vestigial just means the purpose changed. The functionality of that body part or organ is different than what it was in ancestral species. So, the creationists like to use the word vestigial to mean useless, when that's not what vestigial means. So the whole idea is, okay, well, the appendix actually has some function. Great. It can still be vestigial, even though it has a function.
Etc. Evolutionary evidences have come and gone over time, many of them even having been soundly rebutted and thrown out by evolution-believing scientists.
Yes, because that's how science works. It fucking progresses and learns new things
Themselves. But despite this, certain prize horses in the evolutionary stable of ideas still persist in textbooks, video programs, and other evolutionary presentations.
So, one of the things that you're going to learn about in science. Oftentimes when we teach children in, student science, we tell them about the history of that science, which is why some of those outdated ideas stay in textbooks.
To this day. And oftentimes, even if they're no longer accepted in the mainstream of modern evolutionary thinking, they're still stuck in people's minds as being authentic and persuasive, as they never check to see whether they were simply victims of the fake news of the day many years ago. And the Heike crab is just one such
The wrinkles on this guy's forehead are really distracting.
example of evidence for naturalism that's persisted in evolutionary lore since 1952, when the grandson of Charles Darwin's bulldog T.H. Huxley, Julian Huxley, published an article titled Evolution's Copycats. His goal was to use an example of natural selection that could be easily understood to explain its ability to cause creatures to adapt. Then extrapolate that.
People need to stop with the creatures thing. All organisms undergo evolution, including bacteria and plants. Why doesn't anybody talk about bacteria and plants?
Idea to try to persuade his audience that all of life's incredible design could be explained naturalistically through evolutionary processes, reinforcing his atheistic views. Huxley's original article in Life magazine described how he believed these crabs came by such a striking feature, and his argument was basically as follows. When superstitious Japanese fishermen saw crabs with any likeness to a samurai's mask, they threw them back, benefiting crabs with a face, resulting in more and more crabs with a more clearly designed samurai mask.
Okay, let me guess. He's going to go ahead and talk about this and then say, well, we actually found that this isn't true because, maybe the face appearance is a function of age or sex or whatever. And here's the thing. I don't think Julian Huxley would care if that idea was disproven. When we do science, we want to be disproven. We want the most true things to be out there and as few false or incorrect things as possible.
Over time. Interestingly, he reasoned that the resemblance of these crabs' carapace to an angry Japanese warrior was far too specific and detailed to be accidental, and thus could only have been brought about by means of natural selection operating over many centuries.
In this case, it would be directional selection, so the more dramatic the feature is, the more likely the organism is to pass it on to its offspring.
The caption on a Heike crab picture in Huxley's original article reads, "Superstitious Japanese people do not eat Heike crab because its shell appears to be imprinted with the likeness of a medieval warrior." Now, it's easy to see how this example of evolution in action.
Now, here's the thing. This is actually really good because predators, things that are eating other things, are going to be cueing in on a specific look to the prey, right? And so the prey that most resembles what the predators are expecting are going to be taken out of the population at a higher rate than things that don't resemble what the predator is looking for. Therefore, over time, the organisms that resemble less of what that predator wants are going to stay put, and they're going to pass their genes on, and yada yada. That's how this shit works.
Came to be so popular. It's pretty logical, has an interesting story attached, and has some cool historical details embedded within it that make it very memorable. Even though most informed modern creationists seeing this today would likely be yawning at this supposed proof of evolution, because they understand natural selection only allows creatures to adapt within limits.
Yes, so here they go, saying that it's not evolution, it's adaptation, because they don't understand what the definition of evolution is. At its core, evolution is just the change in gene pool over time. So, let's just suppose you have a beach in Florida, and this beach has a nice bunch of trees, a bunch of mangrove trees, and on those mangrove trees are some Phlebodium aureum, because I just love Phlebodium aureum. It's a huge fern that's native to Florida fern, if you will. Well, it's called blue star fern. And let's say you have, 800,000 mature Phlebodium aureum hanging from those trees. They're epiphytes, so they're hanging onto mangrove trees. They're growing off the branches of the mangrove trees. And half of the Phlebodium aureum have this, purple color to the base of the leaves, whereas the other half have a green leaf base. Okay? Are you following me? And they're evenly distributed throughout the mangrove forest. Now, a hurricane comes in, and the salt water splashes over the mangrove trees and kills. And let's just pretend that the color of the base of the leaf is controlled by a simple genetic, one gene, and purple is dominant, whatever. Hurricane comes in and kills, 210 of the green base leaf Phlebodium and 135 of the purple base. Now, the proportion of green to purple allele Phlebodium aureum has changed during that time. So evolution has occurred in this population. No need for any reproduction, no need for any other things going on. That is an example of evolution that I'm sure that these creationists would agree could happen and will happen, and at least causes some change in that population. What they won't agree on is whether or not it's called evolution, but it is what evolution is about. And what happens is, over time, that sort of thing multiplies through the system to cause things like adaptation, speciation, and other stuff that they disagree with.
And doesn't cause the types of changes that could evolve anything in the particles to people sense. Many people back then bought it as strong evidence for the story of evolution.
Well, technically it is evolution.
Its acceptance continued to grow even more, likely because of its being promoted by one of the most prominent evolutionary popularizers of the 1970s, Carl Sagan.
Carl Sagan was more into physics than biology. And look, no offense to physics people, I'm not a physicist. I stay in my lane, they should stay in their lane. Physicists should not be talking about biology, just like biologists should not be talking about physics. We just don't know enough. Because in order to devote enough of your brain to physics, you can't be well versed in biology, and vice versa. I don't like physics. I don't know jack shit about physics.
Both in his book and in his Cosmos TV series, Sagan argued like this: how does it come about that the face of a warrior is cut on the carapace of a Japanese crab? How could it be? The answer seems to be that humans made this face. If you're a crab and your carapace is just ordinary, the humans are going to eat you. But if it looks a little bit like a face, they'll throw you back, and you'll be able to have lots of nice little baby crabs that all look just like you.
Yes. Now, there are some problems here. Nothing in biology is simple. And this is an oversimplification of biology. And I will use this particular type of reasoning for people who have never taken a biology course before in their lifetime. But beyond that, we don't use this sort of language for this specific reason. You're making a shit ton of assumptions here. First, you're making the assumption that this feature of the carapace, which is that top portion of the crab shell, that feature, how it looks, is completely genetically mediated. Now, most traits are not mediated only by genetics. Also, you're assuming that this mediation is a simple one gene dominant versus recessive allele relationship, which may not be the case. You can have codominance, incomplete dominance. It could be polygenic. It could be epigenetic. I mean, there are like 10 different things that could go into how genes are expressed to make this carapace appearance. The other thing you're assuming is that the biggest selective pressure on these crabs is predation from humans, which may not be the case. And see, these people aren't well versed enough in biology to understand this.
Well, at the time, this all seemed pretty powerful to many a layperson and science student alike. But as we're about to see, aside from the historical details about the Battle of the Two Clans, it's a complete fabrication. But it's one that many uninformed skeptics still bring up as...
I mean, I've never heard of this specific example before I watched this video. I mean, I've heard of the peppered moths, I've heard of the fucking Piltdown Man and the intestine thing, the appendix. I've never heard of these crabs. I thought this video, because I saw a crab, I thought this was going to be about that meme of like, oh, evolution produced crabs 8 times and, whatever. That's a whole other matter.
Supposed scientific proof of evolution, and a reason to deny the God of the Bible. Now, as mentioned, even if true, this example of natural selection would be no big deal anyway, because natural selection is a process that selects from genetic information already available within the DNA of a creature, whereas what evolution requires is brand new genetic information for never-before-seen forms.
Okay, question. What are you defining as brand new genetic information? Because at its base, there are only about 9 or 10 different nucleotides that are going to make up DNA. Now, of course, we've been taught, guanine, adenine, cytosine, thymine, and uracil. But there are a couple of other base pairs and this and that can be put in the DNA code and put. I mean, obviously when they teach this even at college levels, they don't go unless you're specifically getting into, genetics. You're not taught that. For the fact that, like, at that level, it's not as important. Until you really are focusing on, genomics and things like that. You don't need to know every possible base pair. I mean, that's just too much. Every possible nucleotide, blah, blah, blah. You don't need to know all that. But it's not just ATCG. Okay? A lot of these, they're called degenerate, or, not degenerate, anomalous base pairs, where, they aren't the classical ATCGU. these are often found in organisms that are like extremophiles, like the archaea that live in thermal vents and shit like that. But anyway, the thing is that what's it called? What was I getting at?
Functions and features.
Oh yeah. Excuse me. New genetic material. Does he mean new genes? Or does he literally mean, oh, because there are only 4 main base pairs, there can't ever be new genetic material? Because what you don't understand is that there are so many different possibilities of peptides coming together to form proteins, this and that. Okay? And what often happens is genes get rewritten to make new proteins that haven't existed before. Genes get duplicated and then the copies get modified. So there is new genetic material that does come along. What happens as DNA replicates is there will be errors that will introduce variety, and some of those variants stick, and some of that leads to new functions, new forms, this and that. It does happen. We've observed it in lab conditions, in fruit flies, in Arabidopsis, which is a plant. We've observed it in different microbes. We've observed it so many times. Like, this is a non-issue.
To arise de novo. However, it's still influential among the uninformed because it can help evolutionists make the takeaway point that because this example of apparent design can be caused by selection, belief in God is not needed.
That's not what they said. There are plenty of people who believe in God who also accept evolution as a fact.
To explain any so-called design in nature, they argue design is simply illusionary.
Yes, unless we're talking about like a domesticated species where we've deliberately designed it, quote unquote, where we've selected for what we want from it.
And can be caused by chance and circumstance given sufficient time.
Why is that so unreasonable?
Huxley actually made this point in his original article by segueing from the samurai crab example to several others, stating, there are plenty of other equally surprising examples of animals or plants acquired.
They would have known in 1952 about microbes, but that's a different matter.
A protective resemblance to other animals or plants or to inanimate objects. Of course, the more astute here will realize the rather deceptive nature of this debate tactic. You simply begin with an example you claim has been proven, to therefore knowing that several other examples of this must also have happened.
See, I agree here because you want to take everything on a case-by-case basis. You know, one of the things we're taught in like 4th grade is that the Viceroy is a Batesian mimic of the monarch. Now, it's actually a Malurian mimic. And for those of you assholes out there who don't know what the difference between Batesian and Malurian are, think Batesian, the B, can also stand for benign. So, a harmless species mimics a harmful one. So, for example, the pipevine swallowtail is very toxic and impalatable to birds. So other swallowtail species that are completely harmless, non-toxic, mimic it. Meanwhile, the Viceroy sequesters salicylic acid, which can really fuck up your liver, by the way. You know, like, you can really cause damage to your liver if you take too many fucking aspirin. But anyway, the Viceroy actually is impalatable as well. It's not as bad for a bird to eat as a monarch, but Viceroys are indeed toxic. So this old idea that Viceroys are non-toxic is bullshit, but that's a different story.
Which weren't observed, of course. The most incredible thing is, none of that matters anyway, because the whole man-crab myth and its related evidences are a complete sham. Listen to the following quotes from Dr. Joel Martin, analyzing the literature describing the supposed samurai crabs. Interesting reading, but it isn't true. Now, for those evolutionists who'd like to differ, understand something. This isn't an idle comment from some crazy creationist. Martin's research as a marine biologist centers on the life histories of decapod and brachiopod crustaceans.
Yes, and that's perfectly fine. I'd rather something that's been an ancient myth be dispelled. It doesn't prove creation.
And he was associate curator of invertebrate zoology at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles.
One of the things to keep in mind is that invertebrate is such a huge category of organisms. If you're the curator of an invertebrate collection, you have sub-curators under you working on different groups. When it gets into the insects, you could have people for different genera. Okay, especially with like certain tiny wasps that are like the size of the tip of a needle. Tiny ass things that every genus has a world expert on it. What this guy doesn't understand is that, it's not like vertebrates where, there are 12,000 or 70,000 described vertebrate species that we know of. There are 70,000 members of various insect families, let alone, the entire group of things that are considered invertebrates.
He's a committed evolutionist, but his scientific knowledge and argumentation absolutely destroys the main elements of this mythical.
Yes, and that's fine. That doesn't destroy evolution as a whole.
His word, samurai crab story. For starters, the idea that this historical battle began the superstitious process that would have evolved the crabs. It seems likely that the man crab legend even precedes the date of the Battle of Dan no-Ura, and was merely fitted to those events later. But even
Okay, so what?
more importantly, he points out the anatomical reasons for why crabs have these features and why they're essential. The grooves are external indications of supportive ridges, called apodemes, inside the crab's carapace that serve as sites for muscle attachment.
Yes, this is fine.
Elevated areas between these grooves allow for an increase in internal space, so that the various parts of a crab's viscera, gastric, hepatic, cardiac, branchial, etc. are reflected externally. So the pattern of ridges on the carapace serves as a very functional purpose as sites of muscle attachment. Understanding this, it's really not surprising then that he notes, these ridges and grooves occur in nearly all members of the crab family Dorippidae, whether they live near Japan or not. Well, so much for the need for samurai faces to have evolved these crabs. And to make the point even more destructive through the superstition argument is that Martin points out that there are several fossil Doripid-type crabs, which evolutionists have to concede predated the samurai warrior caste by...
Yes, and here's the thing. There are all sorts of weird stories about why something looks the way it does. I don't care. It's a non-issue. What's really important is what the evidence shows. Just because, an astrophysicist person who had a TV show has one, crackpot idea about why a crab looks the way it does when he's not a biologist, doesn't mean that the entire theory of evolution is bunk.
thousands upon thousands of years by their own evolutionary timeline. If there were samurai crabs before there were samurai, the story doesn't make much sense at all. So if similar patterns are found on the carapaces of other species and genera throughout the world, including numerous fossil taxa, does this famous evolutionary man crab icon have any legs to stand on?
My question is, does one poor example of something invalidate an entire scientific theory?
According to Dr. Martin, no. To top it all off, he reveals what he calls the most damning to the myth. The fishermen who make their living from the Sea of Japan do not eat any of these crabs. Whether they resemble a samurai, a human face, or merely a crab is a moot point. All are thrown back. For Doripe japonica reaches a maximum size of only 31 millimeters, or 1.2 inches across the back. not at all worth the trouble of retrieving from the nets, let alone sorting through to see which one resemble a face and which do not. With the icing on the cake, so to speak, that the fishermen don't use Heike crabs for food, and as such there's no artificial pressure favoring face-shaped shell patterns when fishermen supposedly examine the crabs they catch, well, what we're left with is a complete refutation of all aspects of this man-made crab myth.
That's all well and good, but, like, the title of the video is Atheists Are Lying to You About This Evidence for Evolution. Like, I've never heard of this before, and I watch a lot of, like, atheist content on YouTube.
Obviously, the fact that these crabs resemble what we think is a samurai.
Okay, it doesn't look that much like a samurai to me. It kind of looks like, I don't know, a Y chromosome?
Is wholly coincidental. So what's the moral of this fishy story? Well, for those of you like me who grew up going to state-run schools, watching mainstream media and entertainment, revelations like this should cause us to consider something. The false narratives that we often readily recognize on our daily news feeds as driven by ideological motivations rather than the truth today have been similarly promoted for as long as sinful man has been communicating with one another. Thomas Huxley was an atheist, which is why he
So what?
was such an ardent defender of Charles Darwin's ideas that supported his worldview. He passed those ideas around to those he knew, which apparently carried down to his grandson Julian. This is why Julian promoted the supposed scientific story of evolution using the false interpretation of where the Heike crabs and their creepy curvature supposedly came from. Carl Sagan was also an atheist, and like seeking like, he probably grabbed onto what Huxley had published.
So I have a real quick Carl Sagan tangent here. He was married to a lady named Lynn Margulis. She was an excellent microbiologist, but she came up with this weird idea. Now, I'm surprised Answers in Genesis doesn't know about this, but they're not the smartest people on the planet, so maybe it's just... She came up with this ridiculous idea that the larval forms of various organisms evolved from separate taxonomic lines than the adults. So, like, caterpillars used to be velvet worms, and at some point they mated with an adult moth, and that made the different life cycle stages of the caterpillar and the moth. And same with, like, frogs and fish, and, like, it's called hybridogenesis, and, like, this weird idea came about, and there were articles about it in the, I don't know, the 30s. It's since been debunked just because of DNA evidence, but it on its face, it's bullshit. I'm surprised Answers in Genesis doesn't have any content, to my knowledge, about just that.
Without much of a critical analysis, accepted and promoted it on the platforms he had developed. Along the way, countless numbers of people would have been influenced by these evolutionary ideas and accepted them even more uncritically, believing that the experts with far more knowledge than they had arrived at these conclusions through science rather than ideology. Rather than sitting back and accepting what everybody knows is truth, perhaps more people should be willing to re-examine the foundations of evolutionary thought and realize it's actually an anti-God premise wrapped in naturalistic philosophy and coated with a thin veneer of scientific credibility. It's also vigorously promoted by and protected from most major institutions from critical scrutiny, which is why people need to do their own analysis rather than being spoon-fed truth from their governments. Those that think, as I once did, that
Remember that we have creationists in the government?
evolution is science and religion, it's faith, need to understand the origins debate is actually a faith versus faith argument, because we all have the same facts. It's simply a matter of whether you're going to put your faith in the infallible truth of God's Word or the fallible opinions of corrupt mankind.
Well, that left much to be desired. So, yeah, I don't have much to say about that. I guess just, remember to be pedantic, demi-romantic, and away from the Atlantic. And I'll see y'all in the next one.